All right, everybody. So we have Sally Norton back on the channel with us today. She's been on a couple times before. She's always my favorite guest. She's so welcoming and coming on the podcast. So I really appreciate that. But now she has an amazing book coming out pretty soon on Amazon. And I saw it's #1 in pain management actually at the moment. So that's great. So congratulations on now becoming a best-selling author, Sally. And we're going to get into some nitty-gritty questions with you today. But first off, how are you doing, Sally? How are you feeling these days?
I'm doing great. Keeping up with too much to do. So that's way better than my days when I didn't know about this oxalate business, when I was completely flattened on the couch and couldn't do anything.
Are you staying healthy?
Yep, staying healthy.
Perfect. I also have Belle Smithson on with me co-hosting today as well. So thank you so much for coming on, Belle.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Sally, for coming on.
Yeah.
Fun to meet you.
So Sally, first, if we could get a brief rundown. We've had you on the channel a couple times before, but if you could first give us a brief rundown as to your story, how were oxalates so damaging to you over the years?
Man, lots of different body parts were getting affected, and I had zero idea that it could be my healthy diet, because I've been into vegetable eating since I was a little kid. My siblings always got picked on, like, Sally will eat that because Sally liked her vegetables. They didn't get glasses like I did in 10th grade. That's probably related. And I started getting arthritis and back pain as a kid, as like 12-year-old. And it got pretty bad where I was quite arthritic all through my 20s. I get this inflammation and weakness. I couldn't have the strength to squeeze a key and turn it in a lock. I ended up having to have foot surgery and interrupted my college career for 4 years. I had to leave Cornell, where I studied nutrition, to have foot surgery and not recover well. And my feet were never great until I was 50, which is a few months after I started really getting serious about eliminating high oxalate foods from my diet. Now my feet work better. It's affected my back health. I have lots of back issues, and I think the oxalates have degenerated my back health. I ended up needing a hysterectomy, and that was a big mess. I had endometriosis, and it just goes on and on. Really bad fatigue. I had to quit my career ultimately, and I was like completely disabled. I couldn't exercise. I could barely read the mail. And it turned out that my brain wasn't sleeping. I didn't even know it. I was so overtired. I didn't know my brain was waking up 29 times every hour, which is why I had to quit my job. I didn't know why I quit my job. I just was bleeding and fatigued, and my back hurt, and I just couldn't. It was so much work to do the work I do, brain work, writing grants and all this. I didn't know that I wasn't sleeping until 3 years later. And then I changed my diet, and I'm functioning. I'm able to write a book and talk to you and work. It's amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. I can tell you, just with myself, oxalates have been a huge problem for me over the years in terms of being a stone former. But I also, it first started with chronic pelvic pain syndrome about 20 years ago. And I saw countless urologists, had countless doses of antibiotics, which further wrecked my gut health. And it was just a chronic problem forever. And I always blamed the calcium instead of the oxalates. So I see it being such a prevalent problem out there, and people, it's like you kind of have said, it's kind of like a thief in the night. Everyone sort of blames everything else, but oxalates kind of gets away with it. But in this community, I find that sometimes maybe everything can be blamed on oxalates. So I want to ask you the question, how can you tell what the difference is between oxalate toxicity and oxalate dumping and everything else? Because I have people coming to me all the time saying, like, I have a rash, or I have vision issues, or whatever. Could that be related to oxalates? How do you know it's not just like histamine intolerance, or just, or mast cell activation, or whatever? Is there a way to tell the difference between these different conditions?
Well, this is kind of a complicated question to answer, but fundamentally, when you're having health problems, it's because some amount of nutritional deficiency and some amount of toxicity is ruining how your cells are working as an individual cell, and we're ruining how the system works, especially with the immune system that's sending out all these chemicals. And everywhere the body has to communicate with itself, it's using chemical messengers to communicate. So down there at the cellular level, you have nutritional inadequacy, you have electrolytes disturbed, you have cell function interrupted with, the energy production has been compromised, you've got mitochondrial damage. That's the suborganelle that generates ATP energy that cells need to do all the things they do. And you've got the cell communication problems, and then the tissues themselves have trouble maintaining the lining of your gut, the lining of your bladder, these things. It's harder and harder to keep those cells, which have to be, you have to make new cells every day. Every day you wear out cells, they get old and die. And you have to have enough energy in the cells to be able to produce the proteins and to do all this magnificent reproduction of cells. And that gets slowed down with this low energy. And so now your barrier function inside your bladder and in your gut and so on starts to break down. And you might see things like shrinking gums or inflamed gums. This is inflammation and trouble with tissue maintenance. So this cell maintenance, tissue maintenance, cell repair, tissue repair. We see with oxalates, for example, that the whole repair and function of mitochondrial maintenance inside cells is interrupted with oxalates. So the thing is, you're getting ruined down at this really fundamental level of your mitochondria and your other suborganelles and how the cell's operating. And oxalate itself is interrupting with intracell communications because the cell uses a calcium ion to decide and tell itself what it should be doing now and communicate. And when oxalates are coming in, it's bad enough, but when oxalates are coming out, there's an even deeper problem. So you said dumping. Dumping is a terminology that was developed by a woman named Susan Owens, who's done some innovative work, and she has a whole Facebook group. And she was one of the ones who really saw this phenomenon, especially in autistic children, where you change from a fairly high oxalate diet that has peanut butter and potatoes in it and chocolate and maybe spinach and almonds and things. This diet, you get the kids off the peanut butter and so on, and they start having new symptoms. They start behaving better, like with the autistic kids, they can communicate better, they're having less tantrums or whatever, their skin might get better, but then they start having white stuff coming out of their penises and their skin rashes, and they will have these little tantrums and things. So this is the electrolyte disturbance, the energy interruption, the cell communication, this is the cellular damage, and now it's coming from inside the tissues being released. And as it's being released in each cell, it's interrupting cell function, and it's now stressing out the vascular system again, and it's now stressing out the kidneys again, and you can actually generate kidney stones and problems with pelvic pain syndrome all over again when it's coming out of your elbow and your bone marrow and your thyroid gland. And because what's been happening under the radar is that we've been eating these standard foods. All of us nowadays grow up on peanut butter sandwiches, whole wheat toast, there's bread in the bran, and especially bad. The peanut butter, the potato chips, the little like tater tots in school, the French fries everywhere, the baked potatoes, it's everywhere. And so we're all over consuming oxalate past what our body can handle. So we're all collecting it. And it's demonstrated in science, in the thyroid gland, something like 85% of us, by the time we're 50 years old, will have demonstratable, essentially like little kidney stones in your thyroid gland. So is it oxalate? Is it something else? Something's messing up your cell function. Something's messing up your immune cells. Something is messing up immune calmness. You're in a pro-inflammatory state, so you end up with sort of autoimmune conditions. What is that something? It's nutritional deficiency and toxicity. Oxalates happen to be a very common toxin that we're exposed to. So in a way, it doesn't matter if oxalate was the original cause of the problem. Chances are you've had too much. Chances are you have it in your body. And chances are eating less of it will help any problem get better. And we see that. We see that people get over chronic lifetime infections, yeast infections, sinus infections, bladder infections, intestinal dysbiosis. This stuff clears up. So it could be many other factors influencing other things in your diet, stress and trauma, electromagnetic pollution, too much nail polish and all this. But really, if you pretend you can fix something without fixing the essential toxicity of oxalate in your diet, and don't understand that you have oxalate in your body now, so there's a little bit of toxicity we're all suffering from, you'll never really get to the bottom of it saying, well, it can't be oxalate. You got to include that in your health plan. If you're frail, elderly, a child, vulnerable, sick in any way, there's no way that this toxin has any benefit to you whatsoever.
Yeah, and so you mentioned, a few disease processes in there, and you spoke about children. I know that like in children's foods, it's almost impossible to get away from now. Everything has spinach in it. If you're buying the packaged foods or whatever, everyone's being loaded up with peanut butter and so on and so forth.
Sweet potatoes too are real popular with children.
Yeah, oh, very popular. Yeah, especially as a first food. Yeah, too. So I know that you suffered with vulvodynia. I've suffered with chronic pelvic pain syndrome. And I know from my case in particular that it was a direct result of oxalates. In fact, I had a case recently where I was including, because I had some digestive problems, and I was including slippery elm and some other herbs in there that I had no idea. I didn't even think twice about. And all of a sudden, my chronic pelvic pain syndrome started coming back after a couple of years of it being completely gone. So I thought that was interesting. So what diseases are the most common with this condition? And when you cut out oxalates, did your vulvodynia sort of resolve kind of quickly, or what happened there as well?
Well, I'm lucky. I haven't had pelvic pain syndrome, and I haven't had the kidney stones, and those are terrible. And I just send you my love, because people don't realize how disabling pelvic pain can be. You can't sleep, and you got to run to the bathroom a lot if you've got urinary frequency, and you got to like know where all the bathrooms are. You can't go out to a play without worrying about it, or go to an exercise class or travel. Like, it's really hard. And I didn't have a lot of that. I had a chronic tendency to yeast infections and itching and thin skin in the genital area. And I would get these times when it would itch and bother me. And then I got a few periods where I was like just 3 or 4 days of like intense burning and unpleasant pain. And I was like, whoa, this is terrible. So mine resolved very easily. And so I thought when I started the diet that the only thing that oxalates might cause that isn't kidney stones and bladder problems was this pelvic pain, or this really the vulvodynia. And so I thought, I don't really have a real problem with oxalates because the vulvodynia goes away so easily. I didn't know about all these other things, that it was causing my osteopenia, that I didn't know why I had osteopenia, but now I know it was from my high oxalate diet. I didn't know it was so neurotoxic. I didn't know that it destroys gut function and causes dysbiosis. None of that stuff is in our education. So I personally everybody has something different, and we don't have an interest from researchers or awareness at all about the connection between oxalates and all these problems, like the bone health problem or the neurological and the mood problem. I think a huge amount of depression, anxiety, and that kind of thing can be this neurotoxicity. And the research suggests very clearly that probably dementia, Parkinson's disease, and MS and neurodegeneration diseases and neuropathies can be oxalate related. So we don't have a denominator, like how many people are expressing the symptoms of this toxicity? How many people are having the toxicity build up with no symptoms whatsoever? Who gets the kidney stones? Well, it's just a subset of 10 or 12% of the population who don't have the superhuman kidneys we've been given. I have great kidneys. I've been peeing out crystal urine for years and years and years, this cloudy urine. I didn't know it was oxalate crystals until about 10 years ago. And my kidneys continue to be fine. So we have a lot of individual vulnerability that's really clear. And like my tendency is to get food allergies and reactivities and things like that. That's in my family. We tend to be allergic types. And so oxalate gets you where you're vulnerable, and your vulnerabilities are some combination of your genetics and the way you use your body. Because wherever your body's been injured or damaged, the oxalate will pile on there. That's where you tend to get the accumulations. And that will keep those conditions from fully resolving or leave behind really invisible symptom wise. So until we figure out like how to measure the toxicity of oxalate with people who don't yet have symptoms, And then how you connect the symptoms to the diet is you change the diet and you see the symptoms resolve, which would take pretty fancy, very well-funded research to demonstrate. So we don't know the denominator, but I personally, after working with so many people, believe that it is so serious. When you finally get really knocked out with oxalate, you can be flat in bed, unable to do anything but get up and pee. I have had several people now get out of bed after years being bedridden. I have a friend and colleague now who started as a client who was paralyzed with a bike wreck because the oxalates in his diet gave him osteoporosis by the time he was in his late 30s. And so by the time he was in his late 40s, he had this bike spill and now he's a quadriplegic. So I believe that when it's finally really getting you, it can be very disabling and it can be devastating, and you can't completely reverse toxicities. You can try to get the nutritional problems corrected, but there's a certain trace to having a toxic, it's a poisoning disease that isn't completely reversible. So prevention is better. Rather than arguing about who and how many, we just know that it can be so devastating that it's something you must really strive to avoid, because none of the foods that are high oxalate are any way necessary for us to consume.
Yeah. And, I'll just give you a quick little story, but I hate to be one of those jerks, but I was at the grocery store recently. They have a juice bar there, right? And there's a woman who comes in and, she has cancer, and I talk to her sometimes. And lo and behold, she's at the juice bar getting a spinach smoothie, right? And so I'm sorry, I don't usually say things, but I had to say something. I said, are you aware of oxalate toxicity? Right? So that brings us to cancer, right? And there was a study that I saw, one study came out on mice. Now, I have no reason to believe that cancer develops, any differently from any other between different animals. I think cancer has the same origin between different species. But what is the link with cancer, and is it just breast cancer, or is it sort of all cancers are related to oxalates?
This is an area that is dying for more attention and research. The research that's there with breast cancer is pretty darn convincing. Very interesting. I just want to point out that juice bars didn't exist when I was a kid, and that we're moving into diets by promoting things like spinach juice and smoothies and almond bread and all these newfangled ways of eating are very toxic because
Yes.
they're so high in oxalate.
Can I just add in one thing?
You make it able to get in your blood. Like juicing is the worst way to eat these foods and smoothies. Like you just make it even more, it's already toxic enough. So I just want to point out, and I really believe, we've seen it over and over again. People with all the money and resources in the world still die of breast cancer when they stay vegetarian and they keep eating these foods. But my clients, sometimes you get the breast cancer from the oxalate removing process. So breasts are very attractive to oxalates because they're glands. Glands tend to pull in a lot of material from the bloodstream and they collect the oxalate. And they're cells that concentrate calcium because they make milk. So the calcium attraction is another reason why oxalates will get stuck there. So we have these little crystals of oxalate in the breast tissue. And then when the immune cells come along, this is what one of the research, there's two sets of research. One of them shows that the oxalic acid ion that's not crystallized yet is breast cell toxic and turns cells into an aggressive, nasty cancer in the breast tissues for sure. That's the tissue they looked at. I think there's another tissue they've looked at that escapes my memory. But then the other set of studies has demonstrated that when the monocytes or the macrophages of the immune cells come along to try to get rid of these crystals, they have to try to eat it, which is very dangerous work. It's kind of like being a kamikaze pilot. You're going to die doing your work. Your job is deadly, handling these crystals. And it tends to transform the normal breast cells into these bone-producing cells associated with aggressive cancer. This is called mesenchymal transition, and it turns the breast cells into aggressive cancer cells and some of them into bone-producing cells. And that's secondary to having the oxalate crystals there. So the confusion in the literature is that, when you get breast cancer, it's only in the cells that have this hydroxyapatite calcium and not the calcium oxalate crystals. What they now understanding, which hasn't been widely picked up, is that it's actually the calcium oxalate crystals that made it possible for the cells to turn into bone cells, right? It turned into this aggressive cancer. So it's the cleanup. You no longer see the oxalate where the cancer is in the breast, because it was the cleanup process that created the cancer itself. So both the initial exposure to the ions in the blood, after you eat it, it goes into your blood and it flows through the whole body. It goes from the gut to the liver, to the heart, to the lungs, to the heart, and then all over the body. The breasts are right there. Doesn't take long for the oxalate to get to the breast. So that initial hit can cause cancer, but then the cleanup, that hit can get stuck in those cells and create crystals. So later on, the cleanup is another chance to create cancer. So you've got multiple places in the exposure timeline where oxalate's creating cancer in breast cells.
Yeah, I'm going to pass it off to Annabelle, but I just wanted to say anecdotally from speaking to that woman, she said, well, everything causes cancer. So I've come to learn, I find that, I try to shout this stuff from the rooftop, oxalate toxicity. But a lot of times it falls on deaf ears, unfortunately, until people become really sick. But Annabelle, I'm going to pass it off to you. You had a couple of questions.
Yeah, I have a few questions. So firstly, that's all incredibly interesting. I had not heard that before, and I've been following you a while, but two things. So firstly, people in the carnivore world do say that, yeah, but there are oxalates in even carnivore foods. So meat, or when you make bone broth, that can be high oxalate and cause issues. What is the difference, in your opinion, between oxalate that is in, I guess, gelatinous material, so flesh, when you make bone broth, and oxalates in plants?
So there's actual oxalic acid and calcium oxalate crystals in plants. They make that. There's very little to none of either one in meats and meat products. What's happening with the connection between oxalate and bone broth, collagen, gelatin, is that the amino acids, hydroxyproline and so on, can be converted in the liver to oxalic acid in the body. This is called endogenous production. So the substrate of too many of these loosey connective tissue style amino acids creates a higher level of oxalate in the body by a small percent. It's pretty small. But you can tell the way this is happening in pre-collagen madness was that whenever you get injured, surgery, tissue breakdown, you have more loose amino acids that you break down connective tissue in the body itself. So that's a time when oxalate levels can be higher. It's also a time when inflammation tends to be up because you just had surgery or injury, or you're a sporting person and you're breaking down your connective tissue, or you have too much oxalate breaking down your connective tissue because the acidity breaks down connective tissue. Oxalate is a connective tissue buster. So if you have more of turnover of connective tissue, you're going to have higher levels of oxalate. You have more inflammation, that creates more of this endogenous production. And the major contributor to endogenous production, besides inflammation, the really biggie, is vitamin C, which is back to the plants. The meat products don't have a ton of vitamin C. There's some in liver, but vitamin C turns to oxalate in the body. Again, it's worse when there's a lot of inflammation, but you need vitamin C. It's an essential nutrient. You've got to have some, especially if you're sick or infected or undergoing inflammation. I think even the sort of dumping process, because it's so inflammatory, the releasing of oxalate from the tissue that occurs after you go to a carnivore diet, which is very low oxalate or zero oxalate, you're going to maybe have times when you need more vitamin C because there is a lot of inflammation and oxidative stress. So it's endogenous production. If you have more than, say, a tablespoon of collagen or gelatin a day, which is probably 2 cups of broth at the most, or maybe 2, if you have more than that a day, you're going to increase the oxalate in the body. But there's not oxalate in the gelatin. It's this collagen amino acids.
Okay, and then the other question that I have is that even though, so we know what the high oxalate foods are, and if people want to know more about it, they should go and read your book, but there are other plant compounds that are also inflammatory. So for example, I've tested a lot of different vegetables, even the low oxalate vegetables like Brussels sprouts and cabbage, for example, they can still make me retain water and I just don't feel as good. Is there any correlation between oxalate there, or is it the other plant toxins? And if so, is it better just to be on a zero oxalate diet, like a carnivore diet, to heal? And is that more optimal, or are there, so kind of like, what's the correlation between all of the other toxins as well?
Well, there's actually like 3 or 4 questions wrapped up in that question. And one of them, so I try to keep them all, track of them in my own head. But one of them is that oxalate itself has caused so much derangement of the immune system and the gut that the chances, if you've had too much oxalate in your body and it's been affecting your immune system and your gut health, which is almost a guarantee these days, you are going to have pro-inflammatory reactions to things in the gut. Like, you've trained the gut and the immune system to be overreactive. I have this problem myself. I just tried apples again recently, and it gave me acne and increased my back pain. That tells me that caused inflammation. It's not necessarily the other toxins, but it could be. It could be plant toxins, but I think it's more a reflection of the terrain of our bodies now are so deranged that we're really become hypersensitive to things. And yes, going to a full carnivore diet can help relax that, because you're just giving the body less things to react to. I feel like my system reacts to antigens and planty stuff very heavily, which keeps me very low on the plant food side myself. And I think listening to your body is the place to land. Like, is this really agreeing with me? And when you get oxalate out of your diet, even if you're a vegetarian, you can get oxalate out of the diet. You don't have to be carnivore to benefit from information about oxalate. And for a lot of people, that's a good place to start, because you don't want to change your microbiome so quickly at the same time you're changing your oxalate exposure. You want to move into these transitions as carefully and awarely and gently as you can, so you don't continue to traumatize your body. But I think the fact that you're really reacting to these, I have the same problem. I feel like my body's sort of allergic to the entire cabbage family, which is 1/3 of the produce department. And it's hard to say how much of that is the toxins. There's lots of other plant toxins, and they all affect gut function. They all are trouble for the gut. So it's often good to get to the elimination diet of meat and animal foods only, if you can find which ones you're not reacting to, because a lot of us are still sensitive. You can be sensitive to the proteins in eggs or milk or beef even. I've developed a sensitivity to beef now, and I blame this gut damage and the chronic inflammation that even comes from the clearing of the oxalate. Just like that chronic inflammation can create the breast cancer, during the cleanup phase of getting oxalate toxicity out of the body, it can probably promote more of this food sensitivity and promotes mast cell activation syndrome, because these crystals are turning on immune system. Once the immune system is stopped sequestering, the body stops holding on, it's ready to let go. The immune system has to do the work. So you get histamine sensitivities, and you get mast cell activation syndrome, you get these food sensitivities and breast cancer. These are all examples of your poor body has too much inflammation going on, and it's a mess.
It seems like the more clean though I get, like the more I guess my gut gets cleaner and my diet gets cleaner, and the more other things improve in terms of my overall health and well-being, then I get more sensitive to things that are like plant compounds.
Well, I think that that's a really interesting phenomenon. We see this with the oxalates too, where suddenly like the least little amount of oxalate in the body's reacting. And I have theories about how that works with oxalates, but I don't really know, how much of this is like, okay, your body's microbiome is part of the story, and you need to do these things very gently. Like maybe you start with a teaspoon of cabbage and say, hey, body, we're going to start learning to eat cabbage again. If there's a way around all of that, but I honor what you're saying, because I see it in my clients too. And I want everybody to know, if you're having a hard time with this and having a hard time finding things to eat, you're not alone. This is a real phenomenon. I mean, I think some people are throwing around words like, words that are sort of judgmental. The current term is like gaslighting, where you're like making the person who's struggling wrong in some way. I think that's really inappropriate. I think we're not humbly standing back and saying, what is this body telling us? What we're not listening carefully enough. And you've learned to listen carefully. And that's part of it, is that you're interacting with the world in a way that's more conscious, and you're letting your body lead you there. How we get to toughness again, where we can handle these things without it being a trauma. That's part of what we as a community need to do together, because I don't think we're going to have the researchers and interested to help us figure it out anytime soon that will give us answers that we need them now. We need to figure this out now. So generally, I encourage people to honor your body and listen to your body. Let that lead you, because if your body's not your best friend, if you're not servant to your body, ultimately there's regrettable future ahead potentially if we're not honoring what the body is telling us.
Yeah. So we do have to wrap things up soon, but I had a question relating to that question. And that is, we could cook out a lot of different types of anti-nutrients, like lectins could be soaked out and boiled out. I saw one, I believe it was a study showing that oxalates could be boiled out, but it says between 30 to 87%. I can imagine that number might be even higher if you use like something like a pressure cooker. What is it? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's interesting that we need more research on this, but like with asparagus, the tests that are done is boiling does very little for the asparagus. And with the high oxalate foods, you might come down 30% or even 50%. But changing something from having 1,000 milligrams of oxalate to 500 milligrams of oxalate is useless, because you shouldn't be eating more than like 10 oxalates at a meal unless you need them to keep you from dumping. So, it's some of it's ridiculous. And many of the studies use 10 to 15-minute boiling times. Now, when you boil your broccoli for 10 minutes, you don't have anything but mush. So you would have to use a fine mesh strainer to strain the mush out of the water. You have to throw away the water because it's a leaching process. It's not about the heat. The heat doesn't harm the oxalate until you get to like 400 degrees centigrade. Forest fire will degrade an oxalate, but you're not going to use a forest fire to cook your broccoli. You're going to use 250 degrees Fahrenheit, and then you're going to use a mesh strainer to dig it out of the water. You're going to throw out the water, and somehow you're going to plop this mess on your plate or turn it into a sauce or a soup, because most people, it's a 3-minute boil for broccoli. I recommend you boil your broccoli. It takes broccoli from kind of high to something reasonable. So that's great for broccoli. We don't know enough, Brussels sprouts probably help some, boil them, and then you can roast them to dry them out a little or something. But it's not the heat. It's the amount of time that you break down the cell walls and then leach out the oxalate. And we don't really know what the timeline is. It'd be nice to test them at 1 minute boiling, 2 minute boiling, and do this like for a half an hour every minute and test it. You have to do it over and over again, year to year, to see if different types of varieties of Brussels sprouts make a difference. There's probably 5 varieties of Brussels sprouts. Who knows? Like, it's so complicated and pricey, and the science doesn't see this as a priority to take care of. So it's not going to happen.
Yeah, I use one app. It's called Oxalate Food Counts. I don't know if you think that's a good app or not. I don't know if you have it listed out in your book, but where can we find a source where it's like, like a reliable source in terms of like the content of oxalates in our food?
Come back to my website in just a little while. We're going to have one.
Okay.
We've been working for 3.5 years to write a database and vet the data and use primary source data. A lot of the lists out there have a lot of mistakes. It's very hard to handle data well, so it makes me nervous. I haven't put out a lot because in writing the book, I just went over and over things and kept finding more mistakes in my own presentation of the data. Just my trying to, translate it for tables. It's so easy to introduce mistakes. It's so easy to use bad data to begin with. There's just a mess. The data is a terrible mess. So even like the Harvard list isn't terrible. It's only got, maybe a dozen mistakes in it. There's lots of places attempting to put lists out, but you can't really trust the data. That's why I tell people, please just use my beginner's guide for now. See the ones we know are super high, cut those way down. See the ones we know are really quite low, reliably. Start using those more. And those 2 changes, less of the high ones, more of the light ones, is usually enough to really help you. And then sweating the data is really for people who are quite sick with oxalates and need to know what they're doing and get more refinement. So, because you can make mistakes like, oh, this lovely protein stuff for smoothies, like powders that you put in blenders and turn into drinkable things. They'll have rice bran in the 4th ingredient, and you won't think that that's oxalate, but it is. So you have to get kind of wise to the brand's an issue and so-and-so's an issue. And I try to walk you through that in the book too.
Okay. Well, that's great. Thank you so much, Sally. If you could quickly run down where we could find your book and what the date of release is. And yeah.
Well, the book is available to pre-order anywhere until it gets released. The original release date was meant to be December 27. There's been a production issue problem, and we're not actually sure the specific date. I keep hearing different dates, but mid-January is most likely when it's coming out. Please pre-order the book. That helps us get the news out that this book is of interest. So it's going to come. I know some people are a little frustrated. They've been waiting for this book for a year or more, and we might have to wait a few weeks longer. So mid-January, I can't give you an exact date, but time flies, and then we'll be having fun.
Okay, well, I'll link the book down below for you guys to do the pre-order. I have pre-ordered it myself. I'm sure Belle has as well. I want to thank you so much again for coming on today, Sally. It's been such a pleasure. And you've been on my channel right from the get-go. I got to just tell you guys this quickly before I go. When I first started my channel, I couldn't find anybody to come on my channel. Okay. The person I wanted the most to come on was you, because I have such a huge oxalate problem myself, and I'm such a fan of yours. And Sally, didn't matter how many people I had on my channel. I probably had 5 subscribers at the time. You totally agreed to come on. You said, I'd love to come on. And I could tell that you're just such an honest, passionate person about this subject. And I really appreciate your input. Belle, you guys, I highly recommend subscribing to her new channel on YouTube. Subscribe to our channel, the Red Pill Health channel, which I know another name change. I'm sorry about that. But yeah, so thank you so much, guys, for coming on. I really appreciate it. And hopefully we could follow up again at some point in the future.
Yeah, thank you for coming on, Sally. It was really great.
It's great to connect with you guys, build our community. Thank you.
Thank you.